Let me tell you about the day humanity almost got itself banned from the Galactic Military Academy. Not banned like expelled from class, banned like remove this entire species from our recruitment program and send them back to their mud puddle. That kind of banned. The Crucible Gauntlet doesn't have a success rate, it has a survival rate, 2%, that's all. In 300 years of operation, this training course had broken Draconians whose scales could withstand plasma fire. It had shattered Krellians who could regenerate lost limbs. It had reduced Valtorians, creatures whose entire biology is built around adaptation, to quivering heaps of existential defeat. The Gauntlet didn't test whether you could survive impossible odds. It tested whether you'd live long enough to regret trying. And on this particular morning, a human named Marcus Webb decided to give it a shot. I should explain what makes this funny. Humans hadn't been in the galactic military for more than 5 years when Marcus showed up. Everyone knew about Earth. That death world out on the rim, with the ridiculous atmosphere and the wildlife that seemed specifically engineered to ruin people's days. Humans had a reputation. They were tough, stupid tough. The kind of tough that made military strategists nervous. But the Crucible Gauntlet wasn't about being tough. It was about being genetically optimized for suffering in ways that most species simply weren't. Marcus Webb didn't care. Marcus Webb showed up in his dress uniform, shook hands with Drill Sergeant Vexthor, and smiled like he'd just been invited to a birthday party instead of a guaranteed disaster. Vexthor was a Krellian. Imagine a walking mountain of muscle and scar tissue given military authority. His left arm was cybernetic, a replacement for the one he'd lost in the Valorian campaign. His face had been through approximately 40 different flavors of violent incident. He had eyes that looked like they'd personally witnessed the heat death of stars and found it disappointing. Vexthor had broken 693 cadets. His record was a matter of pride. He looked at Marcus Webb and made a decision that would haunt the administrative board for years to come. You want to run the gauntlet? Vexthor's voice sounded like gravel being churned inside a broken engine. Yes, sir, Marcus said. Humans are biologically fragile, Vexthor continued. Your skeletal structure is weak, your organs are delicate. Your oxygen requirements are inefficient. The gauntlet is not designed for your species. It is not designed for beings this structurally inferior. Right, Marcus said, still smiling. You will fail. You will suffer. You might die. Not might. Probably will. Got it. The gauntlet, Vexthor said, leaning closer with all the warmth of a thermometer reading absolute 0, is biologically impossible for you to complete. Marcus considered this. Then he stuck out his hand for a shake. When do I start? Vexthor stared at the extended hand like it was a poisonous snake wrapped around a bomb. He didn't shake it. Instead, he grabbed Marcus by the shoulder and dragged him toward the preparation chamber. Tomorrow, 0500, don't eat breakfast, don't sleep, don't try to prepare, nothing will help. Marcus grinned wider. Sir, yes, sir. As Vexthor stomped away, and Vexthor always stomped, even on soft carpet, he muttered something in Krellian that the translation systems refused to process. The recording logs later showed that at least 3 staff members had to leave the room to compose themselves. Nobody, and I mean nobody, had ever smiled at Vexthor while being told they were going to fail. Nobody had ever looked at impossible odds and treated them like a suggestion. Nobody had ever made the Crucible Gauntlet sound like an inconvenience rather than an apocalypse. Marcus Webb was about to change that. And the universe, it turned out, wasn't ready. The gravity maze looked like someone had taken a normal training course and then convinced physics to take it personally. Corridors twisted at gravity-defying angles. Walls became floors, became ceilings, depending on which direction the gravitational field decided to point. The entire thing was calibrated for species that could naturally withstand 4 G-forces without their internal organs staging a rebellion. Humans? Humans could handle about 2. Marcus Webb entered wearing a suit that would have cost more than a small spacecraft. It regulated his oxygen, managed his core temperature, and provided what the manual termed aggressive stabilization support. What that meant was the suit would keep him conscious through sheer technological spite. It couldn't make the gravity stop trying to liquefy his brain, but it would make sure he stayed aware while it happened. In the observation room 30 meters below, Vex Thor sat in the control center with Lieutenant Cora, a Valtorian who actually had working empathy circuits, and 3 other instructors who were already taking bets on completion time. 2 minutes, said Instructor Krell, a Dracovian with scales that still showed scorch marks from his own Gauntlet attempt. 90 seconds, offered Instructor Pash, an alien who'd watched the Gauntlet destroy 84 different species. Lieutenant Cora didn't place a bet. She was busy calculating the exact point where Marcus's cardiovascular system would probably give up and file for divorce from the rest of his body. Play the challenge, Vex Thor commanded. The first corridor activated. Gravity ramped up to 3 Gs immediately, which was not a respectful introduction. Marcus staggers forward like he'd just been hit by a truck made of physics. His legs buckled. His arms hung heavy enough that lifting them required genuine scientific effort. But he didn't stop. He couldn't really walk properly at first. So he crawled, literally crawled like a baby who decided to enter a military competition. Later, during the debrief, he'd joke that it was the world's worst yoga session. At the time, it was survival. The instructors in the observation room watched with the casual cruelty of beings who'd already passed this exact same challenge and wanted to see how badly a human would fail. Marcus reached a section where the floor angled up 45 degrees, 3 Gs, on a slope. Geometrically speaking, it was the kind of thing that made human structural engineers weep openly. Marcus stopped for exactly 4 seconds. His entire body was shaking. Even through the suit, his physiology was broadcasting distress signals. He looked up at what had to be a 20-meter crawl, with gravity trying to slam him backward at every centimeter. Then he smiled. Not a brave smile. Not an encouraging smile. This was the smile of someone who'd remembered that he was fundamentally stubborn and that quitting would be admitting defeat to an alien rock with physics programming. He started climbing. His suit's power reserves were dropping. Red indicator lights were flickering on the monitor that Cora was watching with the intensity of someone witnessing an actual miracle. His heart rate was elevated enough that it could probably set off seismic sensors. Internally, Marcus was pretty certain his spleen had filed a formal complaint. But he was moving. 1 hand up, 1 foot up, then repeat, slowly, painfully, ridiculously. He's actually doing this, Krell said, standing up from his chair. He's definitely going to collapse, Posh countered. Look at his vitals. He's got maybe 2 more minutes before his body decides this is stupid. Marcus reached the top of the slope. His breathing sounded like an engine in distress. His muscles were screaming what amounted to a hostile takeover bid. 54 seconds had passed since he started this particular section. The gravity shifted. New corridor. 4 Gs. The absolute peak that humans were theoretically capable of surviving for short periods if they were properly medicated and had really good insurance. Marcus stood there for a moment, looking at the challenge ahead. He was still smiling. Still ridiculous. Still refusing to accept that his body had reasonable limitations. He started running. Actually running. Running through 4 Gs like he'd just remembered that surrender was for quitters. Vex Thor sat motionless in the observation chair. His scarred face revealed absolutely nothing. His cybernetic arm made a low humming sound that indicated elevated stress levels. He's going to make it through this zone, Cora said quietly. I don't think I believe what I'm watching, but he's going to make it. Marcus stumbled through the exit portal at exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds. He fell to his knees on the other side, absolutely wrecked, gasping like he'd personally held back the tide with his bare hands. Then he looked up at the nearest camera, grinned with the last reserves of his dignity, and asked if there was a snack bar. The control room went completely silent. Even Vex Thor seemed momentarily confused by the question. Did the human just... Posh started. Completed the gravity maze in 4 minutes and 17 seconds, Cora finished, while appearing to find the entire experience mildly inconvenient. The atmospheric chamber was where the Gauntlet started treating you like a personal enemy. This wasn't about strength or reflexes. This was about finding the solution to a scientific puzzle, while various combinations of toxic gases slowly accumulated in your system and your oxygen supply dwindled like a bad stock portfolio. The scenario was specifically designed to exploit each species' unique vulnerabilities. For oxygen breathers, the air got progressively more lethal. For species that processed methane, that gas was introduced. For beings that relied on specific mineral compounds, those were stripped away. It was customized psychological warfare disguised as air quality problems. For Marcus, it meant standing in a sealed chamber, watching his oxygen reserves tick down, while 3 separate puzzles displayed themselves on screens covered in condensation and despair. The instructors didn't think he'd make it past 30 seconds. "The human will panic," Vexthor stated flatly, watching the monitors. "Humans have primitive threat responses. Suffocation triggers irrational behavior." "Actually," Cora said, pulling up some psych profiles, "humans have evolved to compartmentalize panic remarkably well. They can suppress it temporarily if he will panic," Vexthor repeated. Inside the chamber, Marcus wasn't panicking. He was doing something worse. He was thinking. The first puzzle required navigation of a holographic maze. Simple enough, except the maze changed every 5 seconds, and your ability to see it decreased proportionally to the CO2 in your bloodstream. Marcus's internal monologue was not what anyone would call reassuring. It was more along the lines of, "Okay, panic later, solve now. Panic later, solve now, do not panic yet." He was sweating. His heart rate was definitely in the territory of impressive cardiac achievements. His oxygen readout was giving him approximately 12 minutes before the chamber started getting seriously hostile. He solved the maze in 90 seconds. The hologram locked with a satisfying chime. Second puzzle, a quantum lock that required rearranging 16 crystalline compounds in a specific sequence. It was the kind of thing that made Valtorian physicists excited at conferences. It was not something humans typically encountered outside of very specialized military training. Marcus studied it for 45 seconds. His oxygen count was dropping. The gas composition in the chamber was becoming something that probably had its own warning label. He looked at the puzzle. Then he looked at his suit's diagnostic panel. Then he smiled like he'd just remembered a really good joke. His suit had a thermal regulation system that could interface with external systems. That wasn't supposed to be possible with the puzzle lock. The designers had specifically prevented that possibility in their specs. Marcus found a way anyway. He bypassed 3 safety protocols using methods that would later be described as aggressively creative and technically illegal. He rerouted power through the crystalline structure, causing it to recalibrate in ways its designers clearly hadn't expected. The lock disengaged with a confused chirp. "Did he just hack our equipment?" Pash asked, checking the diagnostics. "He did," Cora confirmed. "He violated approximately 6 different security protocols. Also, it worked." Third puzzle. Arrange a series of chemical compounds to neutralize the atmospheric toxins. This required knowledge of chemistry, physics, and a certain willingness to make decisions that would get most beings executed if they were wrong. Marcus had about 4 minutes of oxygen left. He worked through the logic rapidly, eliminating compounds that wouldn't work, combining others that probably shouldn't be combined, creating something that was either a solution or an explosion waiting to happen. He activated the mixture. For exactly 2 seconds, nothing happened. The instructors in the observation room were already preparing their failure documentation. Vexthor's scarred expression was showing what might have been the slightest hint of vindication. Then the atmosphere cleared. Not gradually, not partially. The gases dispersed like they'd been offended by the chemical mixture's existence. The toxic compounds neutralized. The oxygen levels returned to something that didn't immediately inspire thoughts of one's own mortality. Marcus collapsed to his knees, breathing in air that suddenly didn't taste like a chemistry lab having an existential crisis. His oxygen counter read 34 seconds remaining. He'd completed the chamber with about 34 seconds before his suit would have had to make decisions about which organs he actually needed. "Well," he gasped into the communication system, "I'm pretty sure I just invented a war crime, but a functional one." Vexthor's cybernetic arm made a sound like grinding metal. Whether that was stress or something else remained classified. The thermal gauntlet wasn't designed by someone who believed in mercy. It was designed by Vexthor himself after losing his entire unit to environmental exposure in the Valorian campaign. Every degree of heat, every second of cold, every temperature fluctuation. They were based on specific combat scenarios that had actually killed Krellians, who were built for more extreme conditions than humans could even imagine. Marcus entered a chamber set to precisely 67 degrees Celsius and climbed. There was an obstacle course inside, naturally. Walls to climb, gaps to jump, platforms that required timing and precision, and a complete lack of self-preservation instinct. The chamber was designed to push your body to its absolute breaking point while your biological systems were already operating at crisis level. After 90 seconds, Marcus was visibly suffering. Sweat was running down his face. His movements were becoming sluggish. His internal temperature regulation was working overtime to keep him from essentially cooking himself from the inside out. He made it through the heat section in 7 minutes. Then the chamber flipped. Negative 40 Celsius. Instant transition from dying of heat to dying of cold. Most species would experience catastrophic system shock. Humans just cursed creatively and kept moving. Cora had officially stopped taking notes. She was just watching the monitors with the expression of someone who'd committed to witnessing a phenomenon that shouldn't exist. He's referring to Earth weather patterns, she observed. He's comparing this to something called New Jersey winters. I don't think that's a real place. It's real, Marcus gasped through the communication system, bouncing between platforms that would have been slippery under the best of circumstances and were actively hostile under these ones. And significantly worse than this, although less dramatic. This is the dramatic version. New Jersey is just the boring version. You're hallucinating, Vexthor said flatly. Maybe, Marcus agreed, because denying it at this point would have been statistically inaccurate. But I'm also not stopping. The instructors watched Marcus complete the thermal gauntlet in 12 minutes and 43 seconds. He emerged, looking like someone who'd decided to wrestle the sun, and the sun had decided that maybe compromise was possible. Vexthor stood up from his chair. His scarred expression had shifted into something that wasn't quite respect, but was definitely in the neighborhood. The human will not survive the psychological maze, he said, not with conviction, with something else. Something that might have been doubt. Cora exchanged glances with Krell. Even the Dracovian instructor who'd failed the gauntlet himself was showing signs of emotional investment in Marcus Webb's improbable survival. Actually, Cora said, I think he might. The psychological maze didn't have walls. It had fears, real fears, specific fears, the kind of fears that your genetic history had encoded into your nervous system over millions of years of evolutionary survival instincts. For a Krellian, it meant encountering scenarios that exploited their herd vulnerability. For Valtorians, it meant experiencing scenarios that threatened their adaptability. For Draconians, it meant confronting environments that overwhelmed their sensory processing. For humans, it meant... Well, the system had to think about this one. Humans had evolved on a death world. Everything there was either trying to kill them or was indifferent to their survival. They'd been hunted by apex predators, they'd lived through ice ages, they'd survived plagues, they'd built civilizations while surrounded by creatures that could disassemble them for spare parts. So, human fears weren't simple. They were contradictory. They were weird. They were specifically strange in ways that made biological sense when you understood Earth's history, but absolutely no sense when you were a computer trying to predict them. The psychological maze system scanned Marcus and got very confused. It tried triggering claustrophobia first. The walls closed in. Marcus joked about New York subway cars. The system increased the pressure. Marcus mentioned crowded beaches. The system malfunctioned briefly because that contradiction wasn't supposed to be physically possible within a single human consciousness. Then it tried its trump card. It created a scenario where Marcus was standing in front of thousands of people who were waiting for him to speak. A presentation. A moment where he had to articulate something important to an audience that was expecting profundity. Public speaking. The one thing humans had collectively decided was sometimes worse than death. Marcus froze. For the first time since entering the gauntlet, he actually froze. In the observation room, Vexthor straightened up. This was it. The human had broken. But Marcus wasn't breaking. He was terrified. Actually terrified. His heart rate spiked to numbers that made Cora wince. His breathing became erratic, his hands actually shook. Then he looked up at the audience in the simulation and realized something. These weren't real people. They were projections. They weren't judging him. They were expecting him to be exactly what he was. Imperfect, stubborn, ridiculous. He started talking. Not eloquently, not gracefully. He talked about why he'd entered the Gauntlet. He talked about believing in something even when it sounded impossible. He talked about the fact that Earth was full of impossible situations, and he'd survived most of them through a combination of luck, stupidity, and pure spite. He talked like he was explaining something to himself, and it worked. The psychological maze locked down its scenarios because it couldn't find any configuration that would actually break him. The system reported a successful completion and essentially gave up. Marcus stumbled out of the maze at exactly 33 minutes and 42 seconds for the entire section. He'd spent the last part actually crying, but he was still standing, still moving, still refusing to accept defeat. Vexthor was standing now. Everyone in the observation room was standing. Even Pash, who'd been certain that the human would fail 3 stages ago, was on his feet. "What is your tactical assessment?" Cora asked Vexthor. The Krellian drill sergeant took a long moment to formulate his response. When he finally spoke, his gravelly voice was different. Still harsh, still intimidating, but acknowledging something fundamental. "Humans don't quit because they're afraid," he said slowly. "They quit because they decide to. This one has decided not to." Marcus Webb collapsed at the finish line like someone had just switched off his skeleton. He was on his back, staring at the ceiling, breathing like he'd personally performed CPR on himself for the last hour. His suit's diagnostic systems were running through error reports at a rate that suggested they'd given up on accurate assessment. He lay there for approximately 45 seconds before managing to speak. "That sucked," he announced to the universe in general. Cora was the first one to reach him, followed by medical staff who were professionally concerned and personally amazed that he was still conscious. Vexthor arrived last, his heavy footsteps announcing him before his scarred silhouette appeared in Marcus's rapidly blurring field of vision. "You completed the Gauntlet," Vexthor said, not a question. A statement of fact that he was still processing. "I did something," Marcus agreed weakly. "I'm not entirely sure what. Survival feels like it happened, but possibly I'm hallucinating that too." Vexthor actually smiled. It was a terrible smile. A smile from something that had been designed by nature to inspire tactical fear. But it was genuine. "You are now one of 48 beings to complete the Crucible Gauntlet in its 300-year history," Vexthor said. "You're the first human. You're probably the stubbornest being I've ever encountered." "That's not a compliment, that's tactical assessment." "I'll take it," Marcus wheezed. The medical staff carried him to the recovery wing, where he spent the next 18 hours being analyzed by beings who'd never seen human physiology perform that many consecutive miracles. His body temperature had fluctuated through a range that should have been impossible. His oxygen levels had dropped to numbers that made physicians question their instruments. His cardiovascular system had apparently decided that normal operation was for quitters and had been operating in what could best be described as heroic survival mode for the entire duration. When they finally let him out, Vexthor was waiting. The Krellian drill sergeant looked different somehow, less intimidating, more contemplative, still terrifying, but that was probably permanent. "The others are asking how you did it," Vexthor said. "They want to know your secret." Marcus considered this with the careful deliberation of someone who was still mostly running on adrenaline and spite. "I come from a planet where everything is trying to kill you," he said finally. "Lightning, hurricanes, creatures with too many teeth, diseases you've never heard of. Gravity, that's slightly wrong. And other humans, obviously, because we're our own worst predators. You grow up on a place like that, and impossible starts looking like Tuesday. Started looking like Tuesday, I mean. Past tense. I've had better Tuesdays, but I've had worse ones too." Cora approached, holding a data tablet that showed Marcus's performance analysis. "Your completion was actually efficient," she said, which was Valtorian code for, "That was amazing and I want to understand it." "You didn't brute force any challenge. You improvised. You adapted. You used methods that technically violated safety protocols, but achieved results. Also, You smiled through the entire thing, which the psychological profile indicates is a coping mechanism. That smile, Marcus said, is just me telling the universe that I'm not going to quit because it's trying to make me miserable. The universe generally respects that, takes it as a challenge. Vex Thor made a low sound in his chest. Humans are not weak, he announced to the observation room that was still monitoring. Humans are insane, and that is tactically valuable. The military academy will be accepting more of your species. This was a mistake I will have to justify to my commanding officer. You don't sound happy about that, Marcus observed. I'm not, Vex Thor said flatly, but I respect the outcome. You've made my job harder. That's respect in Krellian culture, except worse. Marcus sat up slightly, still looking like someone had decided to use him as a novelty stress toy. So, about that, he said. When's the next Gauntlet opening? I want to run it again. I want to try it without the smile next time. The observation room went completely silent. Did you just volunteer to repeat it immediately? Cora asked, which was Valtorian code for, have you experienced a complete neural shutdown? Yeah, but without the smile. I think I can do better. I was smiling because I was terrified. Next time I'll just be confident about the terror. That's growth. Vex Thor's expression shifted into something that might have been regret. I'm revoking my recommendation for your species, he said. This was clearly a bad idea. One human is a miracle. Multiple humans with that level of stubborn insanity is a security threat. Sir, Cora said carefully, I think that's actually the highest compliment you could possibly give. Vex Thor stomped away toward his office, muttering in Krellian about recruitment policies and the structural stupidity of allowing humans into military training programs. In his wake, he left one successfully completed impossible challenge, 47 historical records that had just become relevant again, and a decision that would change the entire military's understanding of what species could accomplish. Marcus Webb lay back in his medical bed, still smiling like an idiot, already planning how to run that gauntlet just a little bit better next time. Because humans were good at impossible things, it was practically a species hobby, and in the offices of the Galactic Military Academy, administrators began the process of either adapting their training protocols or accepting that humans were about to become their most common nightmare. The universe wasn't ready for what it had just started. But then again, humans had never really waited for anyone to be ready.